People have been surviving brutal winters for thousands of years without Gore-Tex, hand warmers, or a weather app telling them it feels like -30. They did it with animal fat, wool, fire discipline, and a body of knowledge passed down through generations. Knowledge that most people today have never encountered and wouldn't recognize if they had. Here is what old-school survivalists knew about cold that modern people forget. The cold doesn't kill you. The mistakes do. The first thing any serious cold weather practitioner understood is that cold itself is rarely the direct cause of death. What kills people in cold environments is a chain of decisions, usually small ones, usually reversible at the time they're made, usually not recognized as dangerous until it's too late to correct them. The classic sequence goes like this. A person gets wet, either from sweat or precipitation. Wet insulation loses most of its thermal value. The person, now cold and damp, begins to shiver, which is the body's mechanism for generating heat through involuntary muscle movement and burns calories rapidly. If the person doesn't eat, stops moving, or makes camp too late, the shivering eventually stops, as the body's core temperature drops below the point where sustained shivering is possible. At that stage, the person typically feels warm, a well-documented phenomenon caused by peripheral blood vessel dilation as the body loses the ability to regulate circulation effectively. That warmth is not recovery. It's the body running out of options. Old-school survivalists recognized this chain and interrupted it early, not when the situation became critical, early. The rule in most traditional cold weather cultures was address problems when they're small, because in the cold, small problems don't stay small. Arctic explorer Vilhjalmur Stefansson, who lived with Inuit communities for extended periods in the early 20th century, wrote, "The Eskimo does not struggle against the cold. He accommodates himself to it the way water accommodates itself to a vessel." That's not a poetic observation. It's a description of a fundamental difference in approach. They knew that sweating was the enemy. Modern outdoor gear marketing spends a significant amount of energy on moisture-wicking fabrics, breathable membranes, and sweat management systems. Old-school practitioners got to the same conclusion from a different direction. Don't sweat in the first place. In traditional Arctic and subarctic cultures, Inuit, Yupik, Athabascan, Sami, managing exertion level to avoid sweating was a core cold weather skill. The Inuit practice of opening clothing layers during physical effort, then closing them during rest, was not casual habit. It was a precisely calibrated system for keeping the insulating air layer in the clothing dry. Sweat-saturated fur or wool loses its insulating capacity immediately. In temperatures below freezing, wet clothing against the skin can cause a person to lose body heat faster than they can produce it. The practical implication? In serious cold, you pace yourself to the point where you're warm, but not sweating. This feels deeply counterintuitive to people who have been trained by decades of fitness culture to equate effort with output. In cold weather survival, effort management is survival management. Going too hard for too long is not a performance indicator, it's a liability. Traditional cold weather garments, particularly Inuit parkas, were designed with this principle built in. The cut allowed ventilation at the hem and wrists. Some designs incorporated a chest flap that could be opened during exertion. The garment managed airflow the way modern technical shells try to, except it worked with the physics of the situation rather than trying to engineer around them. They ate fat, and they ate a lot of it. Modern nutritional advice and traditional Arctic survival knowledge are in direct conflict on the subject of dietary fat. And in a cold weather survival context, the traditional knowledge is correct. The human body generates heat through metabolic processes, and fat is the most calorie-dense fuel available, approximately 9 calories per gram, compared to 4 calories per gram for protein or carbohydrate. In extreme cold, the body's basal metabolic rate increases significantly as it works to maintain core temperature. Traditional Arctic populations, Inuit, Yupik, and their relatives, subsisted on diets that were approximately 50 to 75% fat by caloric content. Seal, whale blubber, fish oil, caribou fat. Not as a cultural preference, but as a physiological necessity. The specific importance of animal fat in cold weather goes beyond simple caloric density. Fat digestion generates heat through a process called thermogenesis. The metabolic processing of fat produces body heat as a byproduct more effectively than carbohydrate processing. In a situation where the body is working to stay warm, eating fat is directly contributing to that effort. Mountain man Hugh Glass, the real one, not the film version, was known to have survived conditions that should have killed him partly because of his understanding of finding and consuming calorie-dense animal fat in the field. The explorers and fur traders who operated in the northern wilderness for extended periods and survived were, almost without exception, people who had learned to eat the way the land required rather than the way they had eaten at home. Traditional pemmican, a concentrated mixture of rendered fat and dried meat used by indigenous peoples of North America and later adopted by fur traders and Arctic expeditions, contained roughly 3,500 calories per pound, almost entirely from fat and protein, and remained shelf-stable for years. Scott and Amundsen's competing Antarctic expeditions of 1910 to 1912 provide a direct comparison of what happened when this principle was applied versus ignored. Amundsen's team ate seal and penguin meat with high fat content throughout the journey. Scott's team relied more heavily on a diet that proved inadequate for the caloric demands of hauling sledges across the polar plateau. Amundsen reached the South Pole and returned. Scott's team died on the return journey. They understood the ground. Modern cold weather camping tends to focus heavily on what you put over yourself. Old school practitioners understood that what you put between yourself and the ground was at least as important. The ground in cold environments acts as a massive heat sink. A person lying on bare, frozen ground loses heat through conduction at a rate that sleeping bag ratings and insulating layers on the top cannot compensate for. Traditional cold weather shelter designs, the Inuit snow shelter, the Finnish winter bivouac, the indigenous people's brush bed, all share a common structural principle. Get the body off the ground and create an air gap or insulating layer between the sleeper and the frozen earth. The effectiveness of the snow shelter, the igloo and its variations, is based primarily on the insulating properties of snow itself. Packed snow contains approximately 90 to 95% air by volume. Air is an excellent thermal insulator. A well-constructed snow shelter with a cold trap entrance, a tunnel that enters below the sleeping platform so that cold air sinks out rather than pooling at floor level, can maintain an interior temperature near 32 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the exterior temperature is -40 or below. That is cold. But -40 is fatal without shelter, and 32 degrees is survivable with proper insulation and a heat source. The difference is 70 degrees, produced by stacked air. The brush bed, layers of boughs, ideally from conifer trees, built up 4 to 6 inches thick before a sleeping bag or robe is laid on top, creates a similar insulating air gap from natural materials and requires no tools beyond the ability to break branches. This was standard knowledge in northern indigenous cultures and in the trapping and exploration community that operated in those environments. It is almost entirely absent from modern cold weather education. They built fire differently. The modern approach to fire in cold weather tends to center on igniters, lighters, waterproof matches, fire starters. Old-school cold weather practitioners were less focused on ignition and more focused on what happened after ignition, because in genuinely cold conditions, getting a spark is the easy part. Keeping a fire alive and making it useful is the skill. Traditional cold weather fires were built for specific purposes, and the design of the fire matched the purpose. A fire for cooking was built differently than a fire for signaling, which was built differently than a fire for warming a shelter entrance, which was built differently than a fire for keeping hypothermic rescues alive. The assumption that a fire is a fire, that you light it and it works, doesn't hold up in sub-zero conditions, wet fuel, or high wind. The long fire, a type of fire built along a log or between two parallel logs rather than in a central pile, was used in woodland cultures across northern North America because it produces a wide heat profile rather than a concentrated point of heat, allows multiple people to warm simultaneously, and can be maintained through the night by adding fuel to the ends rather than the center. The reflector fire, a fire built in front of a slanted wall of bark, branches, or snow that reflects heat back toward a sleeping area, concentrates warmth directionally rather than radiating it equally in all directions. dramatically improving the efficiency of the fire for warming a person rather than the surrounding air. The practice of building a base fire platform on frozen ground, using a layer of green logs to elevate the fire above direct contact with ice or saturated soil, was standard among northern woodland peoples and among trappers who had learned from them. A fire built directly on ice or frozen ground will melt its way down and extinguish itself before it reaches useful temperature. In a survival situation where fire is the difference between a manageable night and a fatal one, losing the fire to a preventable mistake is not a footnote. It's the ending. Green wood for the platform base, dry wood for the actual fire built on top of it. This distinction was understood by anyone who spent serious time in winter wilderness. It required a few extra minutes at the start. Those minutes paid back across the entire night. They knew what to wear and in what order. The system of layering that modern outdoor gear companies sell as a technical innovation was understood in principle by traditional cold weather cultures for centuries. It just looked different. The Inuit double parka system, an inner garment worn with the fur facing inward and an outer garment worn with the fur facing outward, creates a dead airspace between the two layers that provides additional insulation beyond what either garment provides alone. The inner layer traps body heat. The outer layer blocks wind and precipitation. The air gap between them acts as a third insulating layer. Modern layering systems, base layer, mid-layer, shell, are functionally identical in principle, derived ultimately from the same physics. What old-school practitioners understood that modern people often miss is the management of that system under varying conditions. The layers were not put on at the start of the day and removed at the end. They were adjusted continuously, opened, removed, added, rearranged, in response to exertion level, weather changes, and the specific task at hand. A person doing heavy work in the cold might have their outer layer fully open and their mid-layer removed. The same person sitting still for 30 minutes would reverse that immediately. Traditional boot systems in Arctic cultures deserve specific attention. Inuit kamik, boots made from seal skin or caribou leg hide, were constructed with a moisture management system built into the material. The hide breathes, allowing moisture vapor from the foot to pass through rather than accumulating. At the end of each day, the boots were dried, and the inner boot liners, often made of grass or other insulating material, were replaced or dried. The maintenance of the footwear was treated as seriously as the maintenance of the fire. Wet feet in serious cold are a medical emergency that develops over hours, not days. They respected wet cold more than dry cold. This is the one that kills the most people who underestimate it. Wet cold, temperatures just below or just above freezing combined with rain, sleet, or wet snow, is physiologically more dangerous than dry cold at much lower temperatures. At -20 Fahrenheit in dry Arctic air, a properly dressed person can function effectively. The cold is severe, but the insulation works as designed because the air is dry and the clothing stays dry. At 35 degrees Fahrenheit in heavy rain, the same person in the same clothing is in serious danger within hours. Because the rain saturates the insulation, the wet clothing conducts heat away from the body at a rate many times faster than dry clothing at a lower temperature, and the temperature is too warm for the person to recognize the danger as immediately as they would at -20. Hypothermia cases recorded in the Pacific Northwest, where temperatures rarely drop to extreme lows, but where cold rain is a persistent condition, demonstrate this consistently. People die of hypothermia in those environments in temperatures that most people don't associate with life-threatening cold. The mountain ranges of the Cascades, the Olympics, the Appalachians, and the British uplands produce hypothermia fatalities in conditions that most people dressed for a rainy day would not consider dangerous. Traditional cultures in wet, cold environments, the coastal indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, the Celtic cultures of the British Isles and Ireland, the fishing cultures of the North Atlantic, developed clothing systems specifically adapted to wet cold rather than dry cold. The oil-dressed wool of traditional Scandinavian and British fishing communities, lanolin-rich wool that retains some insulating capacity even when wet, treated with natural oils to shed surface moisture, was not an aesthetic choice. It was the correct material for the environment. It was eventually replaced by cheaper synthetic materials that perform worse in the same conditions, which is one of those commercial efficiency stories that has a quiet body count attached to it. They knew that shelter came before everything else. Modern survival education has produced the rule of threes. A person can survive 3 minutes without air, 3 hours without shelter in extreme conditions, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. The hierarchy is correct, but old-school practitioners understood it at a practical, rather than conceptual level that the modern formulation doesn't fully capture. In serious cold, the 3-hour shelter window is not a guarantee. It is a ceiling. A wet person in wind at 20 degrees Fahrenheit can develop severe hypothermia significantly faster than 3 hours. A person who doesn't recognize the early signs of hypothermia, the uncontrolled shivering, the loss of fine motor control, the difficulty making decisions, may not be capable of building shelter by the time they decide to try. The practical implication that traditional cold weather practitioners lived by: you build shelter before you need it. You stop and make camp while you still have the physical and cognitive capacity to do it properly. The decision to push on, to try to make it to the cabin, the road, the trailhead, in deteriorating conditions is one of the most consistent decisions preceding cold weather fatalities in wilderness search and rescue records. Alaskan bush pilot and survivalist Bradford Angier, who wrote extensively about wilderness survival in the mid-20th century, put it this way: the time to make camp is when you first think about making camp, not when the decision has been made for you by darkness or exhaustion. He was describing something that experienced cold weather practitioners had understood long before him, but it's worth saying plainly because people still don't do it. They used snow as a tool, not just an obstacle. Modern cold weather psychology tends to treat snow as an adversary, something to be cleared, avoided, insulated against. Traditional cold weather cultures understood snow as a resource, and the practical applications of that understanding go well beyond igloo construction. Snow as insulation. A thick layer of undisturbed snow on a forest floor creates a subnivean environment, the space beneath the snowpack, where temperatures remain near 32 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of what's happening above. Small animals exploit this instinctively. A person who digs into an undisturbed snowbank and creates a small enclosed space can achieve the same thermal shelter from nothing more than a stick for digging and the snowpack that's already there. The quinzhee, a snow shelter made by piling loose snow, allowing it to sinter for approximately 2 hours, and then hollowing it out, requires no special tools, no skill beyond basic shaping, and produces the same interior temperature profile as a traditionally constructed snow house. Snow as a water source. In survival situations, eating snow directly is a documented cause of accelerated hypothermia because the body must expend heat energy to melt the snow, and the water absorbed at near freezing temperature further draws heat from the core. The correct method, well understood in traditional cultures and now confirmed by physiology, is to melt snow using body heat applied to small amounts in a container against the skin, or by using a fire, and then consume the water. The distinction between these two approaches is the difference between hydrating and accelerating your own decline. Snow as a navigation aid. The way snow settles on the windward versus leeward sides of ridges, on trees and in valleys, provides consistent directional information that old-school practitioners read as easily as a compass. Wind, in most temperate and Arctic regions, has a prevailing direction, and snow deposition patterns reflect that direction with considerable consistency. Knowing how to read the snow tells you which way the wind was blowing when the last storm came through, which tells you your cardinal orientation relative to the terrain. They had rules about frostbite that modern people don't know. Frostbite is one of those subjects where folk knowledge diverged sharply from what science eventually confirmed, and the traditional wisdom turned out to be mostly right, while the folk remedies that replaced it were mostly wrong. The old rule: do not rub frostbitten tissue. The cellular damage from frostbite results partly from ice crystal formation within the tissue, and the crystals are sharp. Rubbing frostbitten tissue, particularly the face, ears, and fingers, the most commonly affected areas, mechanically ruptures the already compromised cell walls and dramatically worsens the injury. Traditional cold weather practitioners in Arctic cultures knew this. The instruction was to warm the affected area gently using body heat, tucking frozen fingers into an armpit, pressing a frozen ear against warm skin, rather than rubbing. The old rule also included, do not rewarm frostbitten tissue until you can guarantee it will stay warm. A thaw-refreeze cycle is dramatically more damaging to frostbitten tissue than the original freeze. Walking on frozen feet, though painful once the tissue begins to warm, is less damaging than thawing the feet in camp and then having to continue traveling. This counterintuitive principle was understood by Arctic peoples and by the trapping community, and is confirmed by modern frostbite treatment protocols that specifically caution against field rewarming unless the patient can be evacuated to a stable, warm environment. The folk remedy that replaced these sensible practices in popular culture, rubbing snow on frostbitten tissue, a practice that was widespread in American and European folklore for much of the 19th and 20th centuries, combined the two worst possible responses, mechanical trauma from rubbing, plus applying frozen material to already frozen tissue. The origins of this practice are unclear. Its persistence, despite its obvious problems, is a good illustration of how folk knowledge can drift away from the practical wisdom it was originally built on. They understood that wind changes everything. The concept of wind chill is well established in modern meteorology. The National Weather Service Wind Chill Index has been in use in its current form since 2001. What is less well understood by most people is the actual physics behind it, and why traditional cold weather practitioners understood the wind as a categorically different threat than still cold air at the same temperature. Wind accelerates convective heat loss from the body's surface. In still air, the body maintains a thin boundary layer of warmed air against the skin that provides some minimal insulation. Wind strips that layer continuously, forcing the body to constantly rewarm the air immediately adjacent to the skin. At high wind speeds, the convective heat loss from exposed skin becomes so significant that the effective temperature experienced physiologically is dramatically lower than the measured air temperature. Traditional cold weather clothing was designed around this reality. The outer shell of an Arctic parka was wind-resistant, not for comfort, but for survival. The windproof layer was as essential a component of the garment as the insulating layer, because without it, the insulation was effectively useless in any wind above a gentle breeze. The hood design of traditional Arctic garments, a deep tunnel hood lined with fur, particularly wolf or wolverine fur, which does not accumulate ice crystals from exhaled breath the way most fur does, created a sheltered microclimate around the face that dramatically reduced wind exposure to the most heat-sensitive area of the body. Experienced cold weather practitioners read wind the way sailors read water. They knew which terrain features channeled and accelerated wind, passes, ridgelines, river valleys, open lake shores, and which provided shelter. They built camps in protected locations, not as a comfort consideration, but as a thermal calculation. A campsite that is 10 degrees warmer than an exposed location, because it is sheltered from a 20-mile-per-hour wind, is meaningfully different from a survival standpoint. They managed sleep in the cold like a technical skill. Sleep management in cold conditions is one of the most practically important and least discussed areas of cold weather knowledge. The modern approach is largely buy a warm enough sleeping bag, get in it, and hope for the best. Old school practitioners treated cold weather sleep as something that required active management. The core principle? The sleeping system has to work with whatever body heat is available at the moment you enter it. A cold body entering a cold sleeping bag will not warm the bag to a functional temperature using the heat it has available. The system requires the person to be warm before getting in, and then the insulation maintains that warmth. The old practice was to generate body heat through light exercise before making camp and entering the sleeping system. Enough movement to raise the core temperature, but not enough to produce significant sweating. Getting into a sleep system already warm was treated as a prerequisite, not an outcome to hope for. Traditional sleep in northern indigenous cultures often involved communal sleeping arrangements, not primarily for social reasons, but for thermal efficiency. Multiple bodies sharing a sleep space generate more heat collectively than the same individuals in separate spaces, and the shared warmth dramatically reduces the individual thermal burden. The sleeping arrangements in traditional Inuit winter dwellings were designed around this principle. The sleeping platform was elevated above the cold trap entrance, taking advantage of convective heat stratification. Warmer air rises, and the sleeping level was positioned to capture it. Waking to maintain fire through the night was standard practice in cold weather cultures that relied on fire for survival. The person responsible for the fire did not simply set a large log and hope it lasted until morning. Fire maintenance was a rotation, a responsibility, a skill, knowing how much fuel was needed, when to add it, how to bank coals to reduce fuel consumption while maintaining enough heat, and how to rebuild a fire quickly if it went out. People who slept through the night in comfortable, centrally heated houses today have never needed this knowledge. People who slept in skin tents at -30 understood it the way they understood breathing. They knew when to stop moving and when not to. The decision to keep moving versus stay put in a cold weather emergency is one of the highest stakes judgment calls in survival situations, and old school practitioners had clear principles around it that modern people rarely know. The general rule that developed through centuries of cold weather experience: in a known location, stay. In an unknown location with deteriorating conditions, the calculus was more complex. A person who is lost but has shelter materials, fire starting capability, and physical reserves is almost always better served by staying in place, building shelter, and waiting for conditions to improve or for searchers to arrive. A person who continues to move in poor conditions expends the caloric and thermal reserves that constitute their survival margin. The exceptions were understood clearly. If your current position offers no shelter material and cannot be improved, movement toward known terrain or shelter is justified. If you know exactly where shelter is and have the physical capacity to reach it before conditions deteriorate further, move. If neither of those conditions applies, stop, build what you can, and conserve what you have. The search and rescue literature is full of cases where people died a short distance from shelter that was visible at the time they made the decision to keep moving. The decision to keep moving in cold conditions is often driven by the psychological discomfort of stopping and acknowledging the situation, an understandable response that kills people with some regularity. Traditional cold weather cultures produced people who could override that response because they had been taught from childhood what the correct response was and why. Anthropologist Anne Feenup Riordan, who spent decades studying Yupik culture in Alaska, described the way cold weather knowledge was transmitted in those communities. Survival knowledge was not taught in classrooms or books. It was taught in the moment, in the field, by people who had lived it. The knowledge was inseparable from the context it came from. That transmission chain has been broken for most people in the industrialized world. The knowledge still exists. The context for receiving it is just much harder to find. Most of what old school survivalists knew about cold wasn't complicated. It was just specific, practical, and built on paying close attention to what the cold actually does to the human body rather than what people assumed it did. A lot of it is still available, in books and from people who practice it. The tricky part is that you need to know it before you need it, because the cold doesn't give you time to learn on the job. If this gave you something worth thinking about, hit the like button. It helps this channel keep making content like this. And if you want more, subscribe and turn on notifications.